Get ready, coin enthusiasts, treasure hunters, history lovers, and everyone who has ever wondered what stories lie hidden in the small, gleaming discs jingling in your pocket, because today we're launching into a high-energy, deep-dive expedition through the world of Washington quarters. This isn't just about face value or loose change. It's about history you can hold in your hand, art you can touch, and stories of minting mysteries, rarity, and incredible value that still captivate collectors around the globe. We're talking about 3 Washington quarter coins that may look familiar at a glance, but when examined closely reveal fascinating production tales, subtle design shifts, mint errors that send collectors into a frenzy, and market values that can surprise even seasoned numismatists. 1967 Washington quarter dollar coin. Imagine the United States in 1967, an era of sweeping cultural change, the space race in full throttle, and an economy that was transitioning in many different ways. In the world of coinage, 1967 was a key moment. The U.S. Mint had recently shifted away from silver coinage entirely, following the end of 90% silver compositions in quarters in 1964. The 1967 Washington quarter represents this new era, struck in copper-nickel clad. And while this coin may seem relatively common at first glance, a deeper look reveals a tapestry of stories about design, production variations, minting errors, and collector demand that have elevated certain examples to prize status. The design continues the Washington portrait that was first introduced in 1932 for the bicentennial of George Washington's birth. The portrait on the obverse was created by sculptor John Flanagan, a profile that embodies dignity and classical restraint. On the 1967 quarter, Washington's features are calm and resolute, his hair tied with clear strands flowing back from his forehead, and the lettering around the rim cleanly marking liberty and "I in God we trust." The reverse holds the American eagle perched on a bundle of arrows with olive branches beneath, a symbol of strength and peace. While this imagery remained consistent throughout decades, subtle details in relief, finish, and strike can differ significantly across individual coins, and these differences are at the heart of what makes certain 1967 Washington quarters so fascinating to collectors. Mintage figures for 1967 are enormous by numismatic standards, with over 1.5 billion quarters produced in total by the Philadelphia and Denver mints. At first blush, this would suggest that finding a valuable example should be next to impossible. But coin collecting isn't just about how many were made. It's about condition, quality of strike, and the rare instances where minting anomalies create something unique. Among 1967 quarters, several varieties and errors are especially sought after. Doubled die obverse, for instance, occur when the die itself receives 2 slightly misaligned impressions, producing lettering or numbers that appear to have a shadow or doubling effect. These are not always dramatic, but when visible, they can command significant premiums. Other errors include off-center strikes, where the planchet wasn't properly positioned when the dies came together, clipped planchets, where part of the coin was missing due to a misfeed, and broad strikes, where the coin expands beyond its normal boundaries due to low pressure during striking. These errors are relatively uncommon compared to the billions of standard coins, but they are highly prized because they represent a deviation from what the mint intended, a glitch in the system that becomes a treasure for the observant collector. Now, let's talk about condition and grading, because that's where the real value differentiation happens. Coins are graded on a scale from poor, P1, to perfect mint state, MS70. For 1967 Washington quarters, a circulated coin might be worth only a couple of dollars above face value, especially if it shows wear and tear. But when you start examining uncirculated pieces, those that show no signs of wear from handling, the values begin to climb. An MS63 grade might bring a modest premium, but an MS65 or higher, where luster shines and contact marks are minimal, can attract serious collector interest. In professional auctions and dealer listings, high-grade 1967 quarters have traded hands for hundreds of dollars. But the real head-turners are the error pieces. A 1967 double die obverse, or a well-struck off-center quarter, can push well beyond 4 figures, especially when authenticated and slabbed by a reputable grading service like PCGS or NGC. Collector demand for these rarities has remained robust, driven by both their aesthetic uniqueness and the thrill of owning something that stands apart from the millions of everyday coins. Market trends also play a role. As numismatics has grown in popularity, interest in modern-era coins, those struck within living memory, has increased. Younger collectors find these attainable relative to much older rarities, yet exciting because of the story behind each era. For investors, rare 1967 quarters occupy an interesting niche. They're liquid enough to trade, yet scarce enough to appreciate in value over time if you hold quality pieces. Another point often overlooked is the regional circulation patterns. Because these coins were widely distributed for general use, they turned up in pocket change, cash registers, coin rolls, and savings jars. But once collectors began actively searching through circulation in the 1970s and 80s, many high-quality examples were pulled from use, meaning surviving gems are rarer than the original mintage figures might suggest. And when you mix that with eye-catching errors, you get the perfect storm for collector enthusiasm. Finally, let's consider the narrative appeal. For many coin collectors, the 1967 Washington quarter isn't just metal and mint marks. It's a piece of American history, born at a moment of transition. It represents the end of an era of silver coinage and the beginning of the modern clad compositions that continue today. It resonates with those who appreciate the blend of art, politics, and economics embodied in every coin. 1987 D Washington quarter dollar coin. Now let's jump ahead 2 decades to 1987 and focus on the Denver minted piece, the 1987 D Washington quarter. Here we enter a different chapter in the Washington quarter saga, one tied to technological advances in minting, shifts in collector preferences, and a robust market for modern coins with subtle, but significant, variations and errors. The basic design remains the same. John Flanagan classical portrait of George Washington still graces the obverse, with the familiar mottos and date clearly displayed. On the reverse, the heraldic eagle still stands as a symbol of national resolve and balance. But the context of this coin's production is significantly different from the 1967 issue. By 1987, the U.S. Mint had fine-tuned its processes using more automated systems and refined die preparation techniques. The result was a more consistent strike quality overall, but it also opened the door to a new range of collectible varieties that numismatists love to analyze. Mintage for the 1987 D quarter was substantial. Over 720 million pieces struck at the Denver Mint. For most of these coins, circulation would be their final destination, changing hands in everyday transactions. But within that massive run, a subset of coins emerged that caught the eye of collectors. Some exhibit weak strikes on particular fields or devices, where the die didn't fully impart its design to the planchet. Others show die cracks, tiny fissures in the die that leave raised lines on the coin's surface. And then there are the ever-popular doubled dies, where elements of the design appear to be doubled due to a misalignment during die creation. Collectors obsess over these details because they represent something unusual, a moment where the minting process, usually so precise, produced a unique artifact. That challenge of spotting an anomaly and verifying its authenticity is part of what drives collector demand. Let's break down what collectors look for in the 1987 D quarter in greater detail. First, strike quality is key. A full-struck example, where the die impressions are crisp and clear, especially in the fine details of Washington's hair and the eagle's feathers, will always fetch a greater premium than a weakly struck one. In the world of modern coins, where tens of millions of pieces exist, subtle differences in strike quality can be the difference between a common collectible and a sought-after specimen. Next, consider the doubled die varieties. These occur when the die itself receives 2 impressions that are slightly misaligned. The result? Letters, numerals, or design elements appear to have a shadow or doubling effect. On some 1987 D quarters, collectors have identified doubled lettering on the obverse, particularly around the date and motto. These varieties can be tricky to authenticate and often require magnification and expert evaluation, but when confirmed, they can command substantial premiums, sometimes in the hundreds of dollars or more, depending on rarity and demand. Die cracks are another category that draws attention. As a die ages and experiences stress from repeated strikes, tiny cracks can form. When a cracked die impresses a coin, the crack appears as a raised line on the coin's surface. Some collectors specialize in these kinds of error coins, looking for distinctive patterns that tell a story about the die's life and eventual failure. Off-center strikes and clipped planchets also appear among 1987D Washington quarters. These errors happen when the planchet isn't properly centered between the dies or when the blank was improperly cut. These pieces can be visually striking and highly collectible, often selling for premiums that far exceed their face value. Another aspect of the 1987D quarter that collectors pay attention to is eye appeal. This refers to how pleasing the coin looks overall, the quality of the luster, the sharpness of the strike, and absence of distracting marks or toning. In uncirculated grades, coins that exhibit nice original luster and clean surfaces can draw interest from both investors and collectors completing high-grade sets. Professional grading services like PCGS and NGC play a huge role here, assigning grades that help buyers and sellers agree on quality and value. In terms of market value, a circulated 1987D quarter typically trades only modestly above face value unless it shows a notable error. However, high-grade uncirculated coins can bring a respectable premium. For example, an MS65 graded example might trade for several dollars, while MS67 or higher can command significantly more. But it's the error coins that elevate the excitement. A well-documented doubled die, off-center strike, or dramatic die crack can push values into the hundreds or even beyond, depending on how dramatic and rare the error is. Collector demand for these coins remains strong for several reasons. First, they are accessible. Unlike much rarer issues from earlier in the century, these coins are common enough that many collectors have the opportunity to find interesting specimens without needing deep pockets. Second, they represent a fascinating intersection of modern minting precision and the unpredictability of production quirks. Third, they fit neatly into broader Washington quarter sets, which many collectors aim to complete from every year and mint mark, adding layers of challenge and satisfaction. 1997D Washington quarter dollar coin. Finally, let's travel to 1997 and take a close look at the Denver Mint's Washington quarter from that year. By the late 1990s, coin minting technology had continued to advance, and the U.S. Mint was producing coins with remarkable consistency. But even within this environment of technical proficiency, the 1997D quarter has captured the attention of numismatists due to its subtle variations, strong strikes, and the occasional error that transforms an ordinary piece into something extraordinary. Again, we're greeted with John Flanagan's familiar portrait of George Washington on the obverse, a design that has endured for decades due to its balanced composition and dignified aesthetic. The reverse still displays the heraldic eagle, a symbol of national pride and endurance. But what makes the 1997D quarter particularly interesting is not just the design itself, but how that design was executed in a high-volume production environment, and how slight deviations from perfection have become prized by collectors. Mintage for 1997D quarters was high. Nearly 1 billion coins were produced. In such numbers, the vast majority circulated and changed hands countless times. But among these millions, there are brilliant uncirculated examples that have survived untouched, their original luster shining as though they were struck yesterday. Coin collectors prize these gems, especially when they exhibit strong, full strikes with sharp details in Washington's hair, the lettering, and on the eagle's feathers. Like the 1987D, the 1997D quarter offers a range of error possibilities that can excite collectors. Doubled dies continue to be a highlight. These require a keen eye and often magnification to identify, but when confirmed they can elevate a coin's value dramatically. Some 1997D quarters also exhibit die cracks or unusual planchet variations that make each specimen unique. Collectors also pay attention to die polish lines, small linear marks left from die maintenance, which can sometimes mimic errors but are actually part of the die's preparation process. Understanding these subtle features and distinguishing them from true anomalies is part of what makes collecting modern Washington quarters both challenging and rewarding. In terms of condition, uncirculated 1997D quarters that receive high grades like MS66 or MS67 from professional grading services are especially desirable. These coins often show exceptional surface quality, original luster, and very few contact marks, a combination that appeals to both collectors and investors. While a typical circulated specimen might only be worth a few dollars, high-grade uncirculated pieces can trade for tens or even low hundreds of dollars, depending on market conditions and collector interest. Error coins from 1997D can bring even more excitement. An off-center strike with a visually dramatic misalignment can draw bids well above standard values. Clipped planchets or broad strikes, though rarer, often fetch premiums because they're visually distinctive and represent notable production anomalies. Collector demand for the 1997D quarter is driven by several factors. First, like the 1987D, it's part of a broader attempt by many collectors to complete Washington quarter sets across years and mints. This goal creates ongoing interest in finding high-quality examples of each date and mint mark. Second, the relative accessibility of 1997D quarters makes them a logical target for newer collectors. Unlike older coins with limited surviving populations, these are out there in circulation and hordes, waiting to be discovered. And third, the presence of identifiable errors adds a layer of treasure hunt excitement. Beyond individual collecting, the 1997D quarter reflects broader trends in numismatics. It shows how even in a modern minting environment, where quality controls are stringent, anomalies still occur, and when they do, they become part of the storytelling that makes coin collecting such a captivating hobby. In conclusion, these three Washington quarters, the 1967, the 1987D, and the 1997D, each tell a unique story of American coinage, blending design heritage, minting technology, production quirks, market values, and collector demand in ways that continue to inspire and intrigue collectors around the world. Whether you're holding a 1967 with an eye-catching double die, a sharply struck 1987D, or a gem mint 1997D with exceptional luster, you're holding a piece of history that connects us to decades of the nation's past. So keep searching, keep learning, and remember that every coin has a story waiting to be told.